Hi, everyone. So for the rest of medical school, you're going to be working between kind of two realms, the way that systems are supposed to work and how systems can go wrong and what can happen with disease. And so I want to today give you some framework of how to think about disease. We're going to start doing that by thinking about the different levels on which life exists. So the very first level is a cell. And so a cell is the smallest unit of life that can stay alive. And we talked about unicellular organisms that are pathogens, so like bacteria and protozoa. And cells make up tissues, and so tissues are groups of cells, and they're all the same kind of cell that perform a function. So say you have cells that all keep things out of your body in the epidermis, so the very top layer of your skin, and all of the epidermis cells basically look the same. They're basically identical, and they all work together to make this function. Next, we have different groups of tissues working together that make an organ. And so an organ is something like your brain or your heart or your liver. And all of these tissues working together perform a specific function. But again, you need different types of tissues to make an organ work. So for instance, in your heart, you need tissues that bring blood in. You need tissues that bring blood out. You need tissues that signal that your heart needs to pump. And so this can be really complex. But basically an organ is just a group of tissues working together. Then you can also have a group of organs working together in an organ system. And so an organ exists in one place in the body. So for instance, your heart is an organ, but an organ system is a collection of different organs that spread all the way through the body, or to different parts of the body, linked to different parts of the body. So in the heart example, you have blood vessels that run all the way through your body to every tissue in your body. You need blood running to them. And so it's spread throughout the body. It's not just the heart. So that's the circulatory system. And that functions to bring blood into and out of all of the tissues in the body. It also cleans the blood. And so for another example, you have your brain, which is one organ, but you also have your nerves, which are in all kinds of parts of your body. So they're in your fingertips, which of course is very far away from your brain. But when you touch something, the nerves in your fingers communicate with your brain, telling them that you're touching something, and that it can be hot or cold, or hard or smooth. And so, point being that the nervous system is located in lots of different parts of your body, but it all works together to make this system of taking in input and giving output and keeping you alive. So finally, if you take all of your organ systems together, you have one organism. In our case, we're really talking about people most of the time. But an organism can also be, for instance, a moose, as we'll see in our next lecture slides. So as another example, on the smallest level, we have a cell. So this is a cell in your intestine. So if we're thinking about the entire body, say it's right here. But the cell is the smallest unit of life. Groups of cells work together to perform very specific functions. And all of the cells in a tissue are the same type of cells. Then multiple types of tissues work together to create an organ, and it has a slightly more generalized function. Organs can exist in different places and all connect to each other and communicate to each other, creating organ systems. And there are just probably a dozen in your body that perform all of the major things that you need to do as a person. And finally, you have an organism. So this full human level. Next, we're going to think about divisions of life that are bigger than organisms. And so you have an organism, like a human, and then an organism lives in population of other organisms that are like it, so other humans, for instance. And so maybe they're all the people who live in Rafat, for instance. And so those organisms interact with one another. And they also interact with the other living things in their community. So for instance, say you have a garden that you grow and you eat from the garden, and then you are interacting with other organisms in your community that are not people. Same thing if you look at a bird when you're walking down the street, or you have a pet. So these are examples of community level interactions because they're interactions between populations, interactions between people and birds, or people and tomatoes, whatever you want to say. In addition, communities interact with the environment around them, which is not alive. So they interact with abiotic factors, and abiotic means not living. So these are things like geographical features, like mountains and rivers and deserts, but they're also things like temperature and humidity in the air. And so it's everything that a community interacts with. All the living things interact with all the non-living things in a specific place. And this creates an ecosystem. Then we have a biome, which are all the ecosystems that look like each other. So for instance, there are a lot of deserts in the world, and deserts all look roughly the same. They have the same temperature range. They have similar flora and fauna, that is, animals and plants that live in them. And so we can think about those as a category because the living things that live there have specific adaptations to their habitat. So a biome is all the habitats in the world that look like something specific. So for instance, you have tundra, and you have ice caps, and you have rainforests, which are all different types of biomes. Finally, we have the biosphere, which is the entire Earth and the sum of all of the living and non-living things on it. So to work through another example, we have one single moose, and that moose interacts with other moose in a population. They also interact with other living things like the grass and jackrabbits and wombats and owls in their community. Their ecosystem also includes things like mountains and rivers and lakes that are non-living things that affect how they live. They're also part of a biome. In this example, maybe they're in Canada or Alaska or Russia. And so those are all ecosystems that look similar to this one. So they make up a biome, which we might call an arboreal forest. Finally, we have the biosphere. So this individual moose is part of the planet. It's part of all of the living and non-living things on the planet. So hopefully this helps you think about the different organizations of life. And so this week we're going to talk about diabetes. We've already talked about how sugar metabolism works when it's working correctly. But now we're going to think about diabetes on every level between a single cell and the full planet. And I urge you to think about disease in this way, that you can think about it on all of these different levels of life. So specifically this week, we're talking about sugar metabolism. And metabolism is defined as the chemical processes that occur within a living organism in order to maintain life. Of course, you need sugar metabolism in order to conduct cellular processes because sugar makes ATP, which is the cellular currency. First, we're going to ask, what are the hormones involved in the sugar metabolism pathway? Importantly, hormones aren't cells, they're just signaling molecules, as in they could not live on their own, and they do not form cellular processes. So the hormones involved in the sugar metabolism pathway are two. First, there's glucagon on the left, and second, there's insulin on the right. Glucagon signals sugar to go into the bloodstream. This happens normally when somebody is hungry and they need higher blood sugar than their body can provide through food at the moment. Insulin does the opposite. Insulin takes sugar out of the bloodstream and into cells. Because sugar is going into cells, they're able to do the process that they're supposed to do. So for instance, if you're talking about a muscle cell, maybe it works together with other muscle cells in order to help you flex your thigh in order to take a step. Second, what are the specific cell types involved in the sugar metabolism pathway? We talked about two specific cell types. We talked about alpha cells and beta cells, which are located in the pancreas. So alpha cells secrete glucagon and beta cells secrete insulin. Of course, you have other cells that are involved, but these are the main ones. Third, what are the organs involved in the sugar metabolism pathway? We talked about two main ones. We talked about the liver on the left and the pancreas on the right. The pancreas is where alpha and beta cells live and where hormones are secreted from. And the liver transforms glycogen into glucose and glucose into glycogen. It's also important to remember that we think about body tissues like muscle tissue and fat tissue in this pathway as well. Glucose comes into these tissues through insulin, and this is really the ultimate goal. However, these tissues are not necessarily considered an organ, even though they might be in organs, because they are not organ specific. So this is the end of the first part of our lecture. And before going on to the second part of the lecture, please try to fill in both the dark and the light boxes on this slide. Quiz yourself and see if you can do it. And I'll see you in the next part of our lecture.